The moment I walked through the front door, I knew something was wrong. My suitcase was still in my hand when I noticed it. The small ceramic dish where my wife always kept her keys was sitting empty on the entry table. She never went anywhere without leaving them there. In 38 years of marriage, that dish had never been empty when I was home. I called her name. Nothing answered back but the hum of the refrigerator. I want to tell you what I found that afternoon, because I think you need to hear it. Not for shock value, not for drama, but because what my son did while I was gone for 6 days changed every assumption I had ever made about blood, loyalty, and the quiet agreements that hold a family together. And because the way I responded to it slowly, carefully, without a single raised voice turned out to be the most devastating thing I could have done to him. My name is not important. What matters is that I am 62 years old. I spent 31 years as a structural engineer. I built things designed to last. I thought I had done the same with my family. My wife and I had been together since we were both 24. We met at a church potluck in Knoxville, Tennessee, and I fell in love with her before I finished my first plate of food. She was the kind of woman who remembered everyone's birthday, who kept a spare key under a fake rock for the neighbor's dog sitter, who called her sister every Sunday morning without fail. She was the steadiest person I had ever known. We had one son. His name is Daniel. We gave him everything we could: good schools, summer camps, a college education paid in full, a down payment on his first apartment. When he married his wife, a woman named Renata, I welcomed her the way I would have welcomed a daughter. I gave the toast at their wedding. I meant every word. For the first few years, things were fine. Daniel worked in real estate sales. Renata worked in marketing for a mid-sized company. They were comfortable. Not wealthy, but comfortable. They came for holidays. We visited them in Charlotte. We were a normal family doing normal things. Then Daniel started talking about a development project. It started about 2 years before everything fell apart. He had connected with a group of investors through a colleague, and they were putting together funding for a mixed-use development on the edge of a growing suburb outside Raleigh. The projections were aggressive, he said. The location was ideal. He just needed to get in early before the opportunity window closed. He asked me if I would consider investing. I told him I wanted to see the documentation first. I sat at my kitchen table for an entire Saturday reviewing what he sent me. I had spent 3 decades reviewing structural and financial plans. I knew how to read a document. What I saw concerned me. The revenue projections were based on assumptions that struck me as optimistic to the point of fantasy. The principles behind the project had thin track records. The legal disclosures were buried in language designed to limit their liability, not protect the investor. I told Daniel I would not be putting money into it. I told him why, calmly and in detail. I offered to walk him through my concerns, line by line. He said I was being old-fashioned. He said I didn't understand how modern development deals worked. Renata was there, and she nodded, along with everything he said, which I noticed but did not comment on. I stood firm. I said no. I told him I loved him and that I hoped the deal worked out, but that I would not be participating. Over the next several months, I found out that Daniel had gone ahead anyway. He had invested money they did not have. He had taken out a personal loan and put in $40,000. Renata had used her annual bonus and added another 12. They were all in on something that, within 14 months, collapsed entirely. The principals behind the project were eventually investigated for securities fraud. The investors lost everything. Daniel lost $52,000. He did not tell me this directly. I found out through my wife, who found out through a tearful phone call from Renata on a Tuesday afternoon. By the time I knew the full amount, Daniel had already been living with the loss for 3 months. He had not said a word to me. Not one. I called him. I told him I was sorry it happened. I told him we could talk about how to move forward. I meant that genuinely. I was not going to say I told you so. That was not the kind of father I wanted to be. He said he needed time. I gave it to him. What I did not know, because I had no reason to suspect it, was that Daniel and Renata had already decided what their next move was going to be. They had already made their plan. And that plan involved me and my wife in a way that I could not have imagined even in my worst assessment of who my son was becoming. In the third week of October, I traveled to the Cleveland Clinic for a cardiac evaluation. I had been managing a mild arrhythmia for 2 years, and my cardiologist in Knoxville had arranged a 6-day consultation and monitoring program with a specialist there. My wife was supposed to come with me, but she had a respiratory infection the week before, and we both agreed it was not worth the travel. We made the decision together. She would rest at home. I would go, get the evaluation done, and be back by the following Thursday. I called her every evening. The first 3 nights, everything was fine. She sounded tired but okay. She asked about my test results. I told her the doctors were encouraged. We talked about what we would have for dinner when I got home. On the 4th night, she did not answer. I called 3 more times that evening. I called her cell phone and the home landline. Both rang without answer. I told myself she had probably fallen asleep early. She had been fighting off the tail end of her illness. I sent a text and went to bed. When she still had not responded by the following morning, I was no longer able to tell myself it was nothing. I called our neighbor, a retired school teacher named Helen who lived 2 houses down and had known us for over a decade. I asked her if she could walk over and check on my wife. Helen called me back 11 minutes later. Her voice was careful in a way that immediately told me something was wrong before she said a single word. She said my wife was at her house. She said my wife had been at her house since the previous evening. She said there was a lot I needed to know. I left Cleveland the next morning before 6. I drove 8 hours straight. I did not stop except for gas. What Helen told me on the phone, and what my wife filled in when I arrived, is as follows. 3 days after I left for Cleveland, Daniel and Renata arrived at our house. They had not called ahead. They showed up on a Wednesday morning, while my wife was having her coffee on the back porch. Daniel told her they needed to talk. She let them in. Daniel sat down at the kitchen table and told my wife that he and Renata were going to be moving into the house. He told her that I had agreed to this arrangement before I left, that we were going to be transitioning the property to them, and that she should begin thinking about what she wanted to take with her to a smaller place. My wife told him that was not true. She told him I had said nothing of the kind to her, and that she did not believe I had agreed to any such thing. Renata placed a document on the kitchen table. It was a property transfer agreement with what appeared to be my signature on it. I had never seen that document in my life. I had never signed it. I had never discussed anything remotely like it with Daniel. Not once, not in passing, not hypothetically. My wife told them the signature was not legitimate. She told them she was going to call me. She reached for her phone. Daniel picked up her phone first. He told her she was confused. He told her she had not been well and that she was misremembering things. He told her she needed to calm down and let them handle the transition. He held on to her phone. For the next 2 days, my wife was in her own home without her cell phone, without a way to reach me, and with her son and daughter-in-law moving boxes and bags into the master bedroom while telling her, repeatedly, that I had arranged all of this, that she was simply having difficulty accepting a change, and that she would feel better once she adjusted. She was 61 years old. She had a lingering respiratory infection. She was alone in her house with 2 people telling her that her own understanding of reality was wrong, that her husband of 38 years had made decisions about her life without consulting her, that she needed to accept this and stop resisting. On the second evening, after Renata had taken over the master closet and Daniel had moved her personal items into the hallway in bags, my wife waited until they were both asleep. She took her house key from the ceramic dish on the entry table. She walked out the front door. She walked 2 houses down in the dark in her slippers. She knocked on Helen's door at 11:15 at night. Helen opened the door and my wife stood there shaking. When I pulled into Helen's driveway that Thursday afternoon, my wife walked out to meet me in the yard. She looked smaller than I remembered from a week ago. That is not something I had ever thought about my wife before, that she looked small. She always seemed to fill whatever room she was in. I held her for a long time without saying anything. Then I went inside with Helen and I listened to everything. I asked clarifying questions. I did not interrupt. I wrote down what I needed to write down. Then I made 3 phone calls. The first call was to my attorney, a man I had worked with for 15 years on property and estate matters. I told him I needed to meet with him the next morning, and I told him why. He was quiet for a moment when I finished. Then he said, "Bring everything you have, and we will start first thing." The second call was to the Knoxville Police Department. I filed an initial report of document fraud and unlawful detainment. The officer who took my information told me a detective would be in contact within 48 hours. The third call was to Daniel. He answered on the second ring. He sounded almost relaxed. He said, "Dad, I've been trying to reach you." He said, "I think Mom has been confused about some things, and I want to explain." I let him talk for about 45 seconds. Then I told him I had just filed a police report. I told him he needed to vacate my property by 9 o'clock the following morning, and that if he did not, I would be having him removed. I told him I would be speaking with my attorney the following day about the document he had placed in front of my wife. I told him I knew the signature on that document was not mine, and that I was going to prove it. He was quiet. I told him I loved him. I told him that would always be true. I also told him that love did not mean consequence-free behavior, and that I intended to let the legal process work exactly as it was designed to. Then I hung up. They were gone by 8:15 the next morning. I know because Helen watched from her kitchen window and sent me a text. My attorney's name is Richard, and in 15 years of working with him, I have never seen him angry. He is a measured man. When I sat across from him the next morning and put the copied document on his desk, Helen had taken photographs of it on her phone before it was removed from the house. I watched Richard's expression go very still, in a way I had not seen before. He studied it for several minutes. He said, "Thomas, this is not a gray area." The document was a forged property transfer agreement. Someone had replicated my signature imperfectly, as it turned out, with several characteristics that a forensic document examiner would later flag within the first hour of analysis. The notary seal was also fraudulent. Richard told me that what had been done was not a misunderstanding or a reckless mistake. It was deliberate. It was premeditated. It had required effort and planning. He asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told him I wanted to proceed completely. Over the following 3 weeks, Richard coordinated with the detective assigned to our case, a methodical woman named Detective Pratt, who requested the original document, interviewed my wife for 2 hours, interviewed Helen, obtained security footage from a neighbor's doorbell camera showing Daniel and Renata's arrival with boxes and bags, and submitted the document for forensic analysis. The forensic analysis confirmed what we already knew. The signature was not mine. The notary seal was registered to a notary in Charlotte who, when contacted, stated she had not notarized any such document and that her seal had been used without her knowledge or consent. That finding opened a second avenue of investigation that I had not anticipated. While all of this was developing, I took my wife to our family doctor, who documented her condition at the time of the incident. The respiratory infection, her state of distress, the psychological impact of what had been done to her in her own home. That documentation became part of the civil case record. I also contacted our bank and had a full audit conducted on all accounts to determine whether any unauthorized transactions had occurred during the 6 days I was in Cleveland. They had not. But the audit itself provided a clean record that the attorneys found useful. Richard filed on 3 counts: document forgery, fraud, and elder financial exploitation under Tennessee statute. The elder exploitation statute applied because my wife was 61 and the actions had been specifically directed at her in the absence of her spouse, using psychological manipulation to coerce her compliance with a fraudulent property transfer. I had not known such a statute existed before this. Richard walked me through it carefully. Daniel hired an attorney. Renata hired a separate one. I did not contact either of them during this period. I had nothing to say that wasn't already being said in legal filings. About 5 weeks into the process, Daniel called me from a number I didn't recognize. I answered because I didn't know who it was. He sounded different from the last time we spoke. The relaxed quality was completely gone. He told me he wanted to talk. He told me he was sorry. He said Renata had convinced him the plan was sound, and that he had not thought through how it would affect his mother. He said he had made a terrible mistake. I listened without interrupting. Then I said, I believe you're sorry that this is happening to you. I'm not sure yet whether you're sorry for what you did to your mother. Those are different things, and they require different conversations. He said he wanted to make it right. He asked what that would look like. I told him that was no longer primarily my decision. He had put it in the hands of the legal system, and the legal system was going to do what it was designed to do. I told him his attorney would be in touch with Richard, and that anything he wanted to communicate should go through that channel. He was crying by the time I finished. I had not heard my son cry since he was in his 20s. I told him I loved him. I told him that was not in question. Then I said, but your mother walked out of her own home in her slippers at 11 o'clock at night because she was afraid of you. I need you to sit with that for a while before we have any other conversation. I ended the call. Detective Pratt called me 6 weeks into the investigation with an update. The Charlotte notary situation had uncovered something significant. The notary seal that had been used on the forged document had been stolen. The notary had reported the seal missing 4 months earlier. The investigation into how Daniel and Renata had obtained it led to a connection with a paralegal in Charlotte, who was already under investigation for involvement in 2 other fraudulent document cases. That paralegal, it turned out, was a friend of Renata's from college. This was important because it meant the forgery had not been a spontaneous, desperate act. It had required acquiring a stolen notary seal from a person already engaged in this kind of work. That indicated planning. It indicated intent that stretched back further than the week I was in Cleveland. Richard told me that this development significantly strengthened the case, and that the district attorney's office had expressed interest in pursuing charges more aggressively than the initial filing had suggested. I am going to tell you something that took me a long time to sit with. When I found out the degree of planning that had gone into what Daniel did, I grieved in a way I had not expected. The loss of $52,000 in that development deal that had been a blow to him. I understood that. Desperation makes people do things they would otherwise never consider. I had tried to hold on to that as an explanation, a way of making sense of behavior that made no sense from the son I thought I knew. But the planning changed what it meant. You don't acquire a stolen notary seal on impulse. You don't coordinate with a fraudulent paralegal because you're panicking. You think about it. You prepare. You wait for the right moment. The right moment he had chosen was the moment his father was 600 miles away being monitored for a heart condition. That knowledge required me to rebuild my understanding of my son from the ground up. I did that privately, without sharing the process with anyone except my wife, and without letting it alter the way I moved through the legal process. Grief and procedure can exist simultaneously. I have learned that. 8 months after I returned from Cleveland, Daniel entered a guilty plea to document forgery and elder financial exploitation. Renata pleaded guilty to accessory charges related to the forgery. The paralegal in Charlotte received separate charges in that jurisdiction. Daniel was sentenced to 18 months in a state correctional facility with the possibility of parole after 12. Renata received 3 years of supervised probation and significant fines. The court also ordered restitution, though Richard was candid with me about the realistic limits of collecting on that order. The civil matter was handled separately. Richard filed on behalf of my wife for emotional distress and the documented psychological harm caused by the 2 days she spent in her own home being told her reality was false. That case settled out of court. I am not going to state the amount, but I will say that it covered every cent of legal fees we had incurred and then some. Before the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to submit a victim impact statement. I spent 4 evenings writing it. I rewrote it 6 times. I want to share a portion of what I said because I think it captures something I have had difficulty articulating in conversation. I wrote, "My son made a calculation. He calculated that my age, my distance, and my wife's illness created a window of opportunity that he could exploit. He was correct about the window. He was wrong about everything else. He was wrong about what his mother was made of. He was wrong about the reach of the law. He was wrong about the kind of father I am. I am not the kind of father who walks away quietly and lets harm go unnamed because the person who caused it shares my last name. I am the kind of father who believes that the most loving thing you can do for someone who has gone badly wrong is to let them face what they have done. I meant that. I still mean it. After the sentencing, my wife and I drove home from the courthouse, and I made dinner. Nothing special: pasta, a salad, garlic bread. We sat at the kitchen table and ate and talked about ordinary things. We talked about whether we should repaint the back porch before winter. We talked about Helen's daughter, who was expecting her first baby in February. We talked about a documentary series we had been watching. At one point, my wife reached across the table and put her hand on mine and said, "I'm glad you were the kind of man who came home." I did not entirely trust myself to respond to that, so I just held her hand for a while. I have been asked by people who know what happened whether I feel any guilt about the outcome for Daniel, whether I wonder if I should have handled it differently, whether I think a father who truly loved his son would have found another way. I have thought about this carefully, and my answer is no. Not because I don't love my son. I do love my son. I love him in the specific, complicated, unresolvable way that you love someone who has shown you a version of themselves you didn't know existed and now cannot unknow. But love is not the same as protection from consequence. I spent my career designing structures that had to bear weight. What I learned in 31 years is that the things that last are the things that are honest about what they can hold and what they cannot. A structure that pretends to be stronger than it is will fail at the moment it is most needed. The same is true of people and families and the agreements we make with each other. My son built something fraudulent and told himself it would hold. It did not hold. What I did was refuse to pretend it had. I have written to Daniel twice since he began serving his sentence. He has not responded. I do not know if he will. I have made peace with the possibility that the relationship we had is one of the things that did not survive this, and that the loss of it is a consequence he chose, even if he could not see that far ahead when he made his choices. I keep the ceramic dish on the entry table. My wife's keys are in it every evening when I come home. Some things you hold on to not because they are grand or significant, but because they are the ordinary evidence that the life you built is still standing, that your person is still there, that the quiet things have survived the thing that tried to undo them. I am 62 years old, and I have learned that the most powerful thing a man can do when someone tries to take what is his is not to rage, not to threaten, not to meet destruction with more destruction. The most powerful thing you can do is to be methodical, to document everything, to stay calm in a way that communicates, without a single raised voice, that you are not someone who can be outmaneuvered by someone who loves you less than you love them. My son thought he was dealing with a tired old man who would be too sad, too confused, or too afraid of losing his son to push back. He had not been paying close enough attention. I pushed back with everything I had, quietly and completely, and I have not lost one night of sleep over it since. If you are watching this, and you are in a situation where someone has used your trust against you, a child, a sibling, a partner, I want to say this to you directly. Your kindness is not a weakness they are entitled to exploit. Your love is not a blank check, and the calmest, most deliberate version of yourself is more dangerous to someone acting in bad faith than anything anger could produce. Be calm, be thorough, be patient, and let the truth do what the truth is built to do.